Okay, so hello. It's Carl. It's not Amanda. It's Carl. Hopefully, you will have seen my. It's a weird, like little. It's like I'm. It's like I'm standing under a ray of sunshine right now. I'm not. I'm in my office. Maybe that's the explanation. Whatever it is. Well, already have squirrel brain. Maybe I should take another sip of caffeine, representing Hello Kitty. All right, back to business. Hopefully, you will have seen another short video message from me, kind of introducing not just my role in psychopharmacology going forward for the rest of the semester, but also just kind of like roughly speaking why this is happening and how we hope it'll help. So both Amanda, and just kind of everyone involved, really. So hopefully you will have seen an introduction, not just as to why we're doing this, but also a more general introduction as to like where I'm starting in the course. There's not much to say about that here. I'm starting essentially where the last class would have been delivered. And I believe the last class had been canceled by Amanda. For whatever reason, I can't remember why, but I'm starting there. So this class on alcohol is going to cover not just alcohol, of course, but I noticed there were some leftovers. I didn't know exactly where they left off. So I just decided to kind of backtrack a little bit and start back at ADME, or the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion kind of story that takes place in the body when the body interacts with psychoactive drugs, like what the body does to the drugs. Remember, that's called pharmacokinetics. I'll say that again after. But other than that, what I was going to say is, please bear with me. It's been a while since, it's been like 2.5 years at least since I've taught this course. And it's been a while since I've had my eyes on and my head really grappling with the details, the nuances of psychopharmacology. It's always there. My background is in cognitive neuroscience from a kind of scientific psychology standpoint. So like it's always kind of there, but it hasn't been there for a while. So please bear with me. I'm going to do my best to introduce you to this absolutely interesting world. And it's cool that I'm kind of coming into this where you start to get into the actual substances themselves. So weeks 1 through 4 are on the fundamental concepts, including a little bit of what will be covered today before I get to alcohol, so-called pharmacokinetics, as opposed to pharmacodynamics, which has to do more with like what drugs do to the body, specifically the central nervous system or the brain, or the neuroendocrine system in general. But yeah, it's kind of cool that my entry point into this will be with respect to the substances themselves, right? It's kind of like the second major portion of the course. Okay, so without any further ado, let's get started today. I'm going to review the agenda real quick. I'm not going to go through the learning outcomes. I'll just have that slide up there and say something really pointlessly not funny or clever. Let's do that. Okay, so here is the agenda for today. Leftovers first. Yeah, so I noticed, I'm not sure if I'm picking up exactly where it should be left off, but it looks like you guys were somewhere at drug absorption / protein binding, and and the idea of drug affinity and how that relates to, like what the point is in terms of talking about drug affinity to begin with. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the remainder of pharmacodynamics, and then I'm going to talk about, obviously, the major portion of today's lecture will be on alcohol. Okay, and we're going to talk a lot about it. We're going to talk a little bit about statistics. This is Dan's version of the course that I don't really get that much into, to be honest. I usually don't include any kind of historical, statistical, current trend information in my courses. I tend to focus a lot more on just what the drugs are, what they're doing, what you could expect to see in someone who is intoxicated by those drugs, and how those drugs affect thought, feeling, emotion, and behavior. But I'll touch on them because they're in the current version of the slides. Like I said, it's been about 2.5 years since I taught this course, okay? Then of course we're going to get into the chemical composition of alcohol. We're not talking organic chemistry, I promise. We're not going to get that detailed, but we've got to get a sense of what alcohol is in order to get a sense of why it does what it does. Spoiler alert, all of these drugs, okay, don't do their work by magic, okay? That means we're going to briefly review, again, pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics for alcohol. Again, you were introduced to the general theory, or I guess like the scientific modeling of pharmacodynamics in the sense of, learning about the central nervous system, learning about neurotransmitters, the neuroendocrine system, right? So hormones. You learned a lot about, I hope, I didn't kind of double check back there, but when I teach the course, I talk a lot about the mesolimbic dopamine pathway system, which is the system that makes any drug use that is rewarding, right? It has to exploit that system to some degree. And then pharmacodynamics. Like one way I like to sum up this difference is that pharmacodynamics relates to what the drugs do to the body, okay? And pharmacokinetics, okay? Think kinesis, kinesiology, body, okay? What the body does to the drug, okay? Once the drug is in there, it doesn't just sit there, right? The body does a whole lot to it before it eventually gets rid of it, okay? Then we're going to talk about the effects of the drug, well, in this case, ethyl alcohol, on the body, okay? We'll talk about what dependence and withdrawal look like with respect to alcohol. Now, I should have mentioned this, by the way, in my introductory video before the video today, by the way. I should have mentioned this, but I'm going to assume, correctly or incorrectly, and again, there's a lot of factors here. I won't get into it, okay? But I'm going to assume that the majority of the fundamental concepts, like what a psychoactive drug is, what homeostasis is, what tolerance is, withdrawal syndrome, right? Maybe you guys even talked about different types of tolerance. There's metabolic tolerance. There's functional tolerance. Like there are different type behavioral tolerance. Okay, I'm going to assume a lot of those concepts were covered. If they weren't, and again, like I hope I remembered to mention, and if I didn't, I'll make sure I make a note of it. I'm going to host an optional kind of open Zoom town hall Q&A session for fundamental concepts. For anyone who needs a real review, like the first 4 weeks of the course, I wasn't really grasping what was going on with, like those really basic building blocks of, like toxicity and tolerance and all that stuff. Like, it's kind of a blur, Carl. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions in a synchronous live format. Okay, so again, I'm not going to review this. I'm sorry. If anyone's just like super interested in watching me read like the course learning outcomes straight out of the course outline, great. I'm proud of you, represent Hello Killy again. Kitty, not Killy. Imagine if that cat's name was Hello Killy. Ooh, it'd be creepy. I promise I'm only going on coffee number 11 today, okay? So I'm not going to read through these. This is just a way of us telling you, hey, what we're going through today is meant to touch on these elements of the course learning outcomes. With that being said, let's jump right in to, I'm guessing, like the last portion of pharmacokinetics, the most important portion of it, by the way. This is the story of what the body, generally speaking, before we get into the specific drugs like alcohol today, what the body does to a drug. Okay, so the story of what the body does to a drug is neatly summarized by this helpful acronym, or it might be helpful to you, it might not be, okay? And we call it ADME, okay? Not like ADME, okay? But like think add me, like add me to your friend list. Oh, that was really lame. Okay. And ADME stands for A, absorption. In other words, how the drug gets into your body, right? Like the drug has to find some way, specifically not just in your body, the drug has to find, okay, let's just leave it at that, right? How the drug gets into your body. And then D is distribution. How does the drug move around in your body? What moves it around? Why does it move it around in that way and not some other way? How fast does it move around? What are the fastest ways for drugs to get absorbed and moved around in your body? Those are really good questions, okay? M stands for metabolism, okay? This is the real answer to the question, what does your body really do to the drug? Like all of this absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, they're all answers to the question, what does your body do to the drug? Metabolism, though, that's how your body processes the drug. Like what does it really do to it once it's in there? Metabolism, one way of thinking, it's complicated, okay, like biochemically, but metabolism, as we'll see, is really just how does your body break down that substance and then eventually, kind of reconfigure it into other substances in order so that they can be excreted. That's E, excretion. How does your body, like another word for excretion, by the way, is just elimination. How does your body eliminate or get rid of the substance? Let's get into these in just a little bit more detail. That was just a quick overview. So again, absorption. Okay, absorption is how your body gains access to the drug. Okay. Now, one of the fundamental concepts I hope that you learned, okay, or I hope that was explained to you clearly enough so that you at least got the fundamentals of it, hence fundamental concepts, is route of administration. That's a fancy way of saying how the drug enters into, is administered into your body. How does the drug get into your body? What is its route of administration? As we'll see, okay, there are primarily, okay, in terms of routes of administration, okay, we are going to focus primarily on 5 routes of administration. And then there's a 6th one that, again, it just, maybe I'm getting old. Okay, I'm seeing some white in here lately, I'm getting old, but the kids out there, they have found creative ways of putting psychoactive substances into their bodies. There's a creative, terrifying route of administration we're going to talk about later, okay? This is just a diagram of the major ones that we're going to look at. In fact, this diagram doesn't even, I don't even like it that much, actually. I should have taken this out. Whoever put that in there, if it was Dan or Amanda, I'm not sure who it is. Look, whoever did, it's okay. I don't like this one because it doesn't have all of the routes of administration. It does tell us, though, one cool thing about this diagram is that it does give us a rough sense, like a rough continuum of the rate of absorption. Okay, so generally speaking, as we'll see, smoking or inhalation, fast, okay? And slow or slowest would be ingestion. Let's get there right now. Okay, so the first route of administration is oral or swallowing. Okay, so taking in a substance, okay, that must be swallowed. That's what we mean by oral administration, whether it's food, right? So whether it's an edible, THC gummy, or whether it's wine or a beer, okay, or even a pill, okay, if it is put into your mouth and must at some point be swallowed, it is considered oral administration, okay? So it's a solid or liquid that is soluble, okay? It can dissolve, by the way, in your stomach contents, okay? So for this reason, we're not going to get into the biochemistry of this. For this reason, liquid, it's kind of intuitive, is it's absorbed far more rapidly. Okay, liquid is just more soluble in stomach contents. Okay, oral administration is the slowest form of administration. Okay, this is partly because, it first has to go through your stomach contents. Okay, you'll see other forms of administration don't have to bother with your digestive tract, right? It doesn't have to go through like the intestines, doesn't have to go through any of that system, especially just their stomach. So it doesn't go through a dilution factor. Second of all, okay, it's the most complicated way, therefore, for drugs to get into your bloodstream, okay? It takes a while. It has to interact with several organs and tissues, as we'll see, before reaching the brain, okay? Examples here, like I said, include pills, alcohol, and methadone in liquid form. Now, by stark contrast, okay, it's like we're starting with the slowest, and then we went second right here to the fastest, okay? The fastest route of administration, again, is not by injection. It's sometimes called parenteral. We don't really use them, not even in clinical context do I find that people, I mean, I still work alongside some RPNs, and like, whenever I use that word parenteral, they look at me like I'm from the 14th century. Like, people just do not use that term. People think it's injection. That's the, fastest way for, like you're mainlining it, right? Especially if it's intravenous. No, it is not. The fastest way for drugs to enter, the fastest way for drugs to get to the brain, okay, is through absorption of the lining of your lungs, okay? So it enters the bloodstream very quickly. It's highly effective, okay? And it's rapid. It is the fastest route of administration, okay? So this applies to so-called smokable and volatile gaseous drugs, as we'll see when we talk about the inhalants later next week, actually, okay? It produces far more rapid effects than any other route of administration, slightly more rapid than injection, typically about 5 to 8 seconds, okay? The main issues, by the way, okay, is that unlike oral administration and parenteral or injection-based administration, again, no one says parenteral, okay, unlike those forms, and possibly others, it is extremely difficult to control the dose of an inhaled substance. For one thing, you're combusting it, or you're vaporizing it, okay, or you're taking in particles that first have to interact with the surrounding environment before they get into your nostrils, okay, or down your throat, whatever it is, okay, it's extremely difficult to reliably and predictably control the dose, okay? Also, when you're combusting or even vaporizing anything, okay, especially volatile gases, and we'll talk about that later again, many materials, okay, can be irritating to the sensitive mucous membranes of your lungs. We'll talk about other mucous membranes later, especially with those really crazy creative kids. Anyway, the most popular forms of inhalation here, or like drugs by inhalation, include tobacco, cannabis, crack cocaine, and the inhalants. The next form of administration, again, no one uses this word, but technically the term is parenteral. Let's just call this injection. An injection comes in 3 forms. Subcutaneous, sometimes known as sub-Q. I don't think anyone really uses that term anymore. I think it was like an old school, like old guard term used in the addictions world. Sub-Q means, subcutaneous, under the skin. Sub, by the way, means under, okay? Cutaneous, okay, refers to the skin. Sometimes the word dermis is used for this, okay? Subdermal, okay? We'll talk about that later. But for us, subcutaneous means just below the skin. It's the safest form of injection. It's very common for, people who are just starting out, as recreational drug users. The drawbacks is that it's very slow absorption. It's kind of inefficient and ineffective, and there's a high risk of infection. Okay, injecting in this way. The second form, kind of going up here, and most people will end up in the last one we'll talk about. The second one is what all of you are very familiar with, not because you do it yourselves. Some of you might, by the way. Some of you might have to inject yourselves with a certain substance every so often. Intramuscularly. Okay, intramuscular means so intra means into. Okay, muscular means the muscle. Or muscles, okay? Intramuscular means into the muscle. It's relatively easy and simple, okay? Like there's no precise, I'm getting right under the skin. And in the case of intravenous, you're not trying to find a vein, right? Or avoid rupturing it. Intramuscular is you just find some kind of fleshy, like muscular material, and you put it right there in the arm or in the thigh, wherever else. The drawbacks here is that it's very painful. Also, slow absorption compared to the last one we're going to look at. And like subcutaneous infection, there's risk of infection. Okay. Finally, the most common, especially among recreational drug users, especially of the opiates like heroin and some amphetamines, is intravenous. Now, intra, again, into, venous refers to the veins. Okay, so into the vein. Okay, directly into the veins, into the bloodstream, therefore. Okay, this is the fastest form of injection, and technically it's the fastest form of, it's the second fastest form of administering drugs into the body. It is the second fastest route of administration. Okay, so about 10 to 15 seconds to reach the brain from the arm vein. Okay, specifically, say going into one of the veins in the arm. The drawbacks is that first, it's possible to inject many irritating materials like particulate matter. This is especially the case if you're injecting on the street and you're part of a peer-using community that's not being very safe. They're using equipment that's not clean, right? Veins can rupture and in some cases collapse. I have seen, unfortunately, and I know we got a couple of nurses in the class, and I really hope you have not had to see abscessed or ruptured, collapsed veins. It is brutal. I've seen people's arms. By the way, just general all-purpose trigger warning for what I'm going to talk about a lot in these slides. Okay, I mean, we're talking about psychoactive drugs and how they hurt people. It's just you can't get around this. I've seen people's arms like walking into a detox, right? Like a withdrawal management center, look like molten lava. Okay, just like hardened lava, black, just almost a sheet on their arm. It is heartbreaking and just remarkable how much we can damage our bodies just by rupturing veins. Okay, and also with intravenous injection, because you're going directly into the bloodstream, there's an increased risk of infection. Okay, you're infecting not just some random part of the body. You're infecting a vein, a really, like the arteries, a very important blood transportation system. Okay, we're going to talk about what the veins and the arteries do. They play kind of almost like a yin and yang sort of role. But also there's an increased risk of overdose. Okay, and we'll get back to things like that when we talk about specific drugs. And that leads us to topical, or sometimes known as transdermal. The word here doesn't really matter. We don't have to play like anatomical like semantics here. Okay, it's just transdermal is my favorite because it really has this notion of a drug penetrating through the skin. Okay, it goes through the skin via a solvent without having to pierce it. Okay, so it's like, imagine the skin, right? The skin is a boundary, right? It's a membrane like any. It's like I'm pretty sure it is the largest membrane in the human body. I think. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm probably just making that up. I'm so sorry. But it's a very large boundary membrane, but it's semi-permeable. Right? It allows some things in and keeps some things out. Okay, totally makes sense. Okay, one of the things that it can allow in this case, a drug that has solvent properties. We don't have to get into the biochemistry of that can penetrate through without piercing. Right, subcutaneous injection. It's similar to this, but subcutaneous injection penetrates the skin by breaking it, by piercing through. A topical transdermal, for example, skin patch in this case, okay? The most popular today being something like fentanyl, and as we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, is so often diverted from its intended therapeutic pharmacological use, okay? A patch can penetrate through the skin and therefore into the bloodstream, but not by piercing it. This allows for very slow, steady absorption, which is awesome. By the way, okay? Do you remember those two laws of psychological dependence? In other words, I told you the two laws of dependence. There was one law of psychological dependence. Okay, the first law, right, of psychological dependence was the faster a drug kind of gets to the brain and produces its effect. In other words, the faster its rate of onset, the more likely it is to produce psychological dependence. Okay? So in other words, smoking crack, for example, would have an amazingly high degree of psychological dependence. Okay, because it gets to the brain quickly and therefore produces its effects very quickly. Okay, inhalation is the fastest way. If you remember, though, the law of physical dependence, okay, pertained to how quickly or how slowly a drug was removed. Okay, right, from your body, right, and therefore how much time it took for its effects to gradually diminish, or not to gradually diminish at all, to just stop. Okay, and the idea is a drug is going to be more kind of physically dependent producing, okay, or more physical dependence producing. Okay, you will get more physically dependent on a drug if it leaves your body faster. Okay, if it leaves your body slowly and steadily and gradually, your risk of physical dependence goes way down. The cool thing about a topical skin patch, okay, there are costs to this, okay, and we'll get to some of them later on, okay, but the cool thing is that slow rate of onset, okay, very slow, that means slow risk of psychological dependence, and slow elimination. Low risk of physical dependence. I'm sorry, this 14th coffee today is, did I say 14? That was 11. Anyway, the next one, okay, is across mucous membranes. There are many ways of absorbing a drug. Unfortunately, there's another way we're going to get to on the next slide, so don't skip ahead. Spoiler alert. But there are many ways of getting a drug across mucous membranes. The most common for our purposes are the mucous membranes that line the nose. Okay, and this is through a form of administration, sometimes called insufflation. Some people confuse this with inhalation. Right? Inhalation is not this. That's insufflation. Okay, inhalation is or breathing in. Okay, inhaling is not the same as insufflating. Okay, I'm sorry. Probably looks like I'm really good at insufflating. Okay, I'm not. So don't take that as me kind of advertising, my enhanced ability to insufflate. But as we'll see in a few weeks, some of the drugs more commonly insufflated are drugs like cocaine, but many others as well. Okay. Now, other mucous membranes include the mouth. And the gums, right? So people who chew tobacco, right? The substance will get absorbed in their mucous membranes. So like the inside of the mouth, the gums. There's all sorts of ways. Unfortunately, there's one particular moist vascularized area that the kids have discovered. Yeah. So this isn't quite across mucous membranes. We might say it's through or via one of the mucous membranes, or two of them in this case. So the kids have found a way, or two ways in this case, to absorb drugs. If you're female, it's two ways. Either through the rectum, or the anus, or vaginally. Okay, and you might think to yourself, other than just enjoying a kind of like meaningfully diverse and interesting life, why the hell would anyone do this, right? Why would you do this? Let me tell you a little story. So I was working with a client, very young girl, and she had been meeting with me quite a while, and we had this kind of therapeutic relationship where, I normally don't like this or tend to allow it as a matter of kind of like professional boundaries. I don't really like it if clients come into their appointments intoxicated, right? Especially extremely intoxicated. It's hard to do any therapeutic work whatsoever. But at the time, I wasn't working in private practice. I was working as a substance abuse counselor for the YMCA. It was a program called the Youth Substance Abuse Program. So it was an OHIP covered program, and I wasn't doing therapy. It was really kind of like supportive counseling, motivational interviewing based, case management stuff, and I was working with this young girl. Let's call her, this is not her name, Brooke. Okay. Hope no one in the class is named Brooke. This is not her name. Now, Brooke at the time was 16 years old, heavily drinking. I mean, chronic drinking. And I remember a couple of times she would come in very drunk. And I thought like, this is not great. But at the same time, I thought, okay, well, Brooke is 16 years old. She's very vulnerable, and she is vulnerable, among other things, to the predatory behavior of people who might take advantage of her, especially in a heightened vulnerable state, namely intoxication. Okay, and she's also very small. Okay, and she's not carrying weapons on her, so she's not really in a position to defend herself. Anyway, for those reasons, I thought I would much rather have her here. Right, I have water bottles. I can give her, like some sandwiches. We had access to those at the Y, like meal supplement drinks, that kind of stuff. One day she started coming in and she did not smell like alcohol anymore. That was interesting. I was like, okay, because usually she would come in and it would just reek. Her choice was rum, by the way, just straight rum. Okay. And I didn't notice on it. She wasn't wearing any kind of perfume. So like nothing was masking the scent of alcohol or anything. It was just, but I didn't notice any scent of alcohol at all. But she was still absolutely just obliterated, okay, from the standards of intoxication. And I thought, well, maybe she's doing something else then. Maybe, shoot, is it like a benzodiazepine or a barbiturate or an opiate or a combination of those things? What if it's something else? I'm getting really worried, okay? And I asked her, hey, Brooke, we've been meeting for a while now. Like, please just level with me. I mean, like normally I can smell the alcohol on you. Are you on anything else today that we should know about? Just in case, right? She's like, no, I'm really drunk. Okay. That really confused me. What do you mean you're really drunk? She said, well, I'm just not drinking, and started laughing. Brooke told me that she had been funneling alcohol into, I'll let you guess which one it was, whether it was door number 1 or number 2. Either way, I learned that day that, humans are just that much more mysteriously amazing than I thought they were. All right. On that bright note, this is just an interesting diagram that you can follow, okay, to look at how, I'm not going to go through it in detail. I'm also too lazy right now to kind of like, draw things on the slides and delete them after. Have a look at this diagram. It'll show you how substances move through. In fact, what I kind of recommend that you do is have a look at that diagram and see how substances move through the body on the basis of your understanding of each type of absorption, right? Each route of administration. Okay, so just a few quick notes on how drugs move through the body, right? They don't move through the body, like kind of like walking on your bones. They have to move through your blood, right? Before they make your way to the most important part of your central nervous system, namely your brain, so that they can interact with the most important neurotransmitters in your body, in your nervous system as a whole. How does blood flow work then? How does distribution throughout the body work? You don't need, we're not going to get a very close, detailed, fine-grained view of this. All I need you to know is that the veins, okay, are what carry the blood towards your heart, okay? And the arteries, okay, do the opposite, okay? The arteries are what carry the blood away from your heart. And your blood gets oxygenated, okay? Oxygen gets, put into your blood in your lungs. That's why the lungs have such an important capacity, as we'll see later. Okay, the primary form of overdose that we're most worried about has a lot to do with a failure of blood oxygenation, or at least a failure of proper blood processing, properly oxygenated, okay, at the level of your brain. We'll get to that later. It's a form of overdose known as respiratory depression. And this is just a diagram that I honestly, again, I did not put this in here. What it does is it tells you kind of in a color-coded way, like in the last slides. Okay, blue here represents your veins. Okay, so again, right, that which carries blood towards your heart. Okay, and the arteries here are represented in red, right, which are carrying blood away from your heart. Now let's talk in a little bit more detail, even though we already have, in a little bit more detail about how absorption works for each of these routes of administration before we briefly talk about protein binding and affinity, and then finally get our way into alcohol. Okay, so we're not going to spend too much time in these next slides going into much more depth and nuance into these routes of administration, but there are a few details that we have to highlight, okay? Some of them I kind of mentioned in passing when I provided an overview, okay? But it's important for us to go through some of these details. Okay, so for oral administration, remember, it is the most complicated and the slowest way for a drug to be absorbed, okay, and therefore distributed, and therefore to produce its effects in the body, okay? It's the slowest and most complicated way. Pharmacologically, or at least what we should say is pharmacokinetically, there are two main reasons for this, okay? Unlike any other form of administration, drugs by this route, okay, have to go through two forms of metabolism before they do anything. Okay, like in the case of inhalation, okay, the drug gets immediately absorbed into the bloodstream and kind of makes its way in a fairly smooth, frictionless way to the central nervous system. Okay, without impediment. In this case, there are at least two primary kind of gatekeepers. The first one, metabolically, is your stomach, okay? The stomach is the first organ to encounter orally absorbed drugs. So the drug, say alcohol, will have to first kind of contend with the contents of your stomach. And there's a whole bunch of enzymes in your stomach too, by the way. We'll talk about that in terms of gender differences later, but there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, not just water, right? And therefore a dilution factor in your stomach, but there's a whole bunch of other chemicals in there that will affect what's going into it. Next, okay, before it goes anywhere else, it has to go through what's called first pass metabolism. Other forms of administration don't have first pass metabolism, at least the last time I checked. This means that drugs taken orally have to then proceed to the liver before they get distributed anywhere else, okay, in order to make their way eventually to the nervous system, okay? A drug that goes through the veins, the drug then goes through the venous system, okay, to the heart and then to the lungs. Okay, so we have stomach, and then we go to the liver for first pass metabolism. Then we finally make our way, right, through the venous system to the heart and then to the lungs, okay? And then the drugs come back to the heart and then out to the body, okay, through the arteries. Finally, okay, at that point, eventually making their way to the brain. That is complicated, okay? That is slow. Okay, there are advantages to this, by the way, and there are disadvantages. We'll talk about this when we get into some substances later on. Okay, next, we're going to talk about drugs taken by injection. So like I said, okay, unlike drugs taken orally, this skips first pass metabolism. It goes directly into the vein, doesn't have to contend with the stomach or the liver at first. Okay. Then the drug goes through the veins to the heart and then to the lungs, and then it goes back to the heart and then to the body. So notice that these steps are remarkably similar, okay, to the like third, fourth, and fifth steps that you get with oral administration. You're just skipping the first two, right? The stomach and first pass metabolism. And then drugs by inhalation, much simpler. The drug goes straight to the lungs, so it skips first pass metabolism, goes to the heart, and then to the body right away. Okay, so it's even faster than injection into the vein. So we're going to talk very briefly here. Okay, this is not a class on complex neuroanatomy and protein binding and affinity. You just need enough here to understand what protein binding is and how this impacts what's known as affinity or binding affinity. Okay, and we're not trying to make you into neuroscientists or pharmacologists. Okay. So remember, drugs are transported not magically, okay, by Expelliarmus, okay? They are transported. It's a terrible joke. I'm sorry. All right. Another visit to Hello Kitty. Drugs are transported by your bloodstream, okay? They're transported in the blood. There is variation, okay, in their ability to, as we say, bind or attach to, connect with, okay, blood proteins. Okay, this variation in ability to bind with blood proteins is known as, cha-ching, protein binding. Protein binding is what determines, okay, the amount of drug, okay, the bioavailability of a drug in its capacity to produce or exert effects on the central nervous system, specifically the brain, and how long that drug remains in the body. Okay, so it determines how much of that drug is bioavailable, okay, in terms of its ability to do anything at all, okay, to produce effects, and it determines how long that drug remains in the body. So remember, ding, 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 this will have a huge role in both psychological and physical dependence. So the following are the so-called principles of protein binding, okay? Again, we're not going to go into huge detail here, okay? I strongly recommend that if you are struggling with these concepts in particular, you either reach out to me, okay? Ask me about these. I'd be happy to explore them in more detail with you. Or, have a look in your textbook. There's a lot of very clear explication of this concept, okay? So drugs with a high binding affinity, okay? A high binding affinity require a higher dose to produce their effects. And they stay in the body longer when they are bound to the proteins to which they have an affinity. Some good examples of drugs that have high binding affinity are THC, right, the primary psychoactive ingredient in the cannabis plant, and fentanyl, okay, which is one of the synthetic opiates or opioids that is especially causing us tremendous concern in the opiate epidemic. Okay, we'll be talking about that one in a few weeks. By contrast, drugs with low binding affinity require a lower dose for their effects, so you need less of the drug, okay, to produce the effect, and they are excreted or eliminated from the body far more quickly, okay, so they have short-lived effects, okay. Short-lived effects means more physical dependence. Remember, the faster a drug produces its effects and leaves the body, the more chances you have of becoming physically dependent on it. Alcohol is a prime example of a low binding affinity drug. And with that, we're going to move on next to the central nervous system depressants.